for one reason or another, most of the people said in my country, I wouldn't be alive or I wouldn't have survived.
Welcome to the Immigrant Experience in America, an immigrant human library, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants in the United States and around the world. Listen in as we add another story to our immigrant human library.
Hello, my friends, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Immigrant Experience in America. We're happy to bring with you today an Afghan-American whose name is Sara Stanizai. Stanizai, did I get that right?
Exactly
Perfect.
right.
Okay, who is a therapist. Actually, let you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you. So my name is Sara Stanizai. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm the owner of Prospect Therapy here in Long Beach, California. We are a queer and trans affirming practice with a special focus on immigrant and diaspora mental health. What I'm really proud of about our practice is that all of our clinicians not only, of course, have so much clinical training and expertise, but we all bring lived experience to the communities that we serve, meaning we share a lot of the same identities and experiences. Of course, I myself, I actually personally love working with couples and I love doing group therapy, but all of us have our own specialties. Um, and it was kind of a process for us to figure out how we wanted to position the practice because while, yes, we focus on the immigrant experience and we also focus on the queer and trans experience, those often in themselves, those are not actual mental health issues. Those aren't really things that, some people come to therapy to process those things, but more generally, people really just need someone who understands those experiences and how they impact the actual thing that they're coming to therapy for or that they need coaching around. Um, for example, how does that impact my depression or my anxiety and what kind of support I get? How does that impact my experience at work and with authority and coworkers? How does that show up in my relationship? So those are really the issues that we work with people on. But I really wanted to put front and center that, um, who we are centering are people within these communities. And there's a different way to approach your work when that's what you're doing. I can talk a lot, so please interrupt me. In addition to running my practice, I really love business coaching other service based entrepreneurs. So it is a lot of therapists and a lot of coaches who are trying to figure out either how to start their own business or how to figure out what their niche is and what their angle is, but also people who are well established. A lot of my colleagues, came to me when I started hiring people. So I've had my practice since 2018. And in that time, I've learned a lot about how to, there's all these buzzwords about decolonizing your practice and how do we have an ethical corporation in America and how do we still support our employees and meet the needs of our clients in a way that aligns with our values. And so I also coach employers around that. Um, Plus, I just love yapping. So I'm always on podcasts. I'm always doing workshops and facilitating and doing speaking engagements. So I really just um, I love what I do and I love talking about it. So you let me know what do you want to know because I will just keep talking.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm interested to know a bit about your heritage, if you could share a bit about that.
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. Yes, people actually come from Los Angeles. Not everybody just moves there, but both of my parents are actually from Afghanistan. They came here in '79. They were escaping war, so they were immigrants slash refugees. They both came here as students, and they were married at the time. But yeah, I was born and raised here in Afghanistan, so my relationship to my culture, I think anybody who is an immigrant or the child of immigrants, those are, by the way, two very, very different experiences. And I do want to make it clear. I know we're talking about the immigrant experience as a first generation American who is actually raised by immigrants. It's a whole other ballgame. And I think, sometimes all of us just kind of get lumped together, but I really respect I was born and raised here, and I don't have the same exact culture clash that other folks might, but there is the experience of being raised by people who do have that culture clash and the generational difference. And one thing I often remind people is that immigrants, our parents are acculturating too. It's just often at a slower rate, or it comes in bursts. Maybe there's a culture shock when you first arrive, depending on your circumstances at that time, where you are in your life, things like that. Um, but for people who are born and raised, there's this sort of slowly growing, we're just in American culture, and there's a sort of ebb and flow of our connection to our heritage and our home culture. And there will be times when you really, really want to fit in, and we will reject our culture. A lot of children of immigrants feel guilt about that or feel sort of conflicted about that. But I just remind people it's a survival strategy. Your parents did it too. Every immigrant goes through it. And I also remind people it's never too late to turn back toward your culture. That, oh, because I didn't grow up speaking the language, now I feel like an imposter. I feel like it feels like a costume to me. Or, my family really wanted to teach me these recipes and I resisted it because I just really wanted. I mean, how many stories have we heard about what I brought in my lunchbox was so embarrassing? Like, people talk about that all the time, which is true. But then there can be conflicted feelings about wanting to go back and really wanting to connect with the culture after a period of time that you've resisted it. I realize you asked me just about my heritage. I want to point out that, the relationship between Afghanistan and the US is very singular, we'll say. And so that in itself is its own unique experience, let's call it.
So part of I mentioned earlier that I'm doing some writing decoding America, right? So for people who might be listening and who may be immigrant, I think when you say singular experience, that's probably a very American way of expressing something,
Mm-hmm.
I might say. And so what do you, I think I assume I know what you mean, but what do you particularly mean when you say it's a singular experience?
I think the relationship between the US and Afghanistan is so complex. I actually don't think it's that complex, but I think they don't want us to know very much about it. But our own relationship to Afghanistan is, um, runs the gamut. There's people who very much are happy to be here and say, well, I'm getting all these opportunities. They often point to things like women's issues. They often point to other social issues that um, people will say, well, America is so, I'm glad I'm here. Um, I think overwhelmingly, though, there are a lot of people who were displaced from their homes in Afghanistan due to invasion and war and being victims of military strategy. And um, when I run my groups for immigrants, but also I run an Afghan-American women's group. Um, when we talk in our groups about what would life have been like if we grew up home, if we grew up back in our family, in our heritage country, um, I did that. I had that question one time in one of my groups, and everybody in that group said, I wouldn't be alive.
Oh, really? As a woman?
Um, this was a children of immigrants group, and it was mixed genders, but for one reason or another, most of the people said in my country I wouldn't be alive or I wouldn't have survived. Like I mentioned, I do work a lot with the queer and trans community, and um, I work with women. I work with people for all different kinds of reasons. Um, so that's a very complicated feeling because how far back do we go? I wouldn't be alive, but not because of colonization or because different cultural rules and different things were imported into our country. And so every culture, every place in the world has had queer and trans people. What their relationship is to these communities has also changed as a result of imperialism, colonization, economic interests, things like that. Um, so I think it's hard for people who are trying to reconnect with their culture and they're not sure which parts of their culture would be authentic to them, or um, you know, there's this ongoing story of India before England, and I'm not Indian, so I don't want to speak for their experience, but India before England was very queer. And when
Wow,
these,
really?
yeah, so I think that goes
Wow.
for a lot of cultures. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the role of women in Afghanistan, for example. Um, and I'm not the political scientist. My father is, and he still speaks regularly on this topic. Um, and I'm saying that just because I'm not, I wouldn't call myself an expert per se, but these ideas are things that I've grown up with, and how they're represented at home and by people, by Afghans, versus how they're represented in mainstream media or by people outside of the culture are very different. And that can cause some cognitive dissonance for people growing up. And it's not just for Afghans, it's for a lot of countries around the world.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, so I was thinking that, when you say singular, that you're thinking that it's like a very unique experience because the issues are, singular to dealing with like Afghanistan, the US relationship, and they're very
Mhm,
complex. You may not have another country with the same sort of issues, right? So
mhm,
but yes, well, thank you for sharing a bit about your background and your work. We do actually interview children of immigrants here, and I do write about like the experience of children of immigrants because it has its own unique challenges and, being caught between two worlds and trying to balance both of them. You leave home, there's one world, you come back home, and there's a whole new country at home.
yeah.
And even though I moved here, I was born overseas and moved here, and having to interact with the US system, like my first place of work was in the US, right? I never worked anywhere else. And so I had to take on a lot of American ways of expressing myself, being assertive, which is very atypical of a collectivist culture. And so I come home and you can't look at adults a certain way, you can't speak up, and it's like the reverse. It's like, so it can be
Mhm.
a warped type of a world, like when you leave home, right?
And every sort of phase in your life, whether you are in school trying to figure out who you are socially, or when you're at work trying to figure out who you are professionally, um, all of those milestones, we're already trying to figure things out. And it's just further complicated by I have to turn all of that off when I go home, or I'm confused which of this is just regular within normal development and which is specifically American. And we learn pretty quickly what gets rejected by our home culture. Um, but it can be really confusing when you're trying to develop an identity to have two different sets of models.
Yes, yes. And so we become third culture people, right?
Mhm,
That's
mhm,
that's the term that's out there. But
mhm.
so I'm interested to, as we're just talking about, these two worlds and navigating that. What was it like for you growing up in LA in particular? California was probably seen as more one of the more liberal state, and then your parents are from Afghanistan. I wonder what the culture at home was like. So what was it like for you growing up?
Yeah, I often answer this question, but I realize I only have my experience. I don't super know what I would compare it to, but what I can say is I did have a really loving home life. I did have really wonderful parents, and I do have a younger sister who's we're very very close. We talk every day. I'm going to talk to her after this. um, so I have memories of, I know my parents were trying as hard as they could. Obviously I'm looking at that with grown up eyes. At the time there was a lot of confusion. English is actually not even my first language, and I almost forgot that. um, and so I remember there was a very sharp divide between at home and outside of the home. I remember really trying to learn social norms, and I remember being a weird kid, and I didn't know if it was because, I mean, didn't know why, because I didn't have a lot of the same cultural references as people. I didn't um honestly, I didn't speak the language as well as people, and I obviously, I didn't eat the same food. And so I think I felt very protected and probably a little sheltered by my parents. Everyone wants to feel safe and protected by their family. But I think the drawback of that was being a little bit too insulated from my peers and wanting to develop the same social norms and cultural references. So I just remember being, I still am, a little weird. I remember that I really was super, super observant. I became very quiet. People now who know me now are kind of surprised to hear that because I'm whatever. I love being center of attention. I'm out there. So, but to learn that I was a little bit of a wallflower and just very observant and always just reading the room constantly. I think that that's probably what helped me become a really good therapist, honestly. But I think that also helped me figure out what version of myself I was supposed to bring into each situation into adulthood.
Did you ever go back to Afghanistan since after you guys left? Did you ever go back? I wonder.
I personally have not, but I have family members who have. I still have family members who live there. So no, I haven't been. But when we would see our extended family here, I didn't realize how how much of the culture people brought with them. And it's been really lovely connecting with other Afghans now who we all kind of had that same experience. It's really interesting and wonderful that when I started doing these Afghan diaspora women's groups, we all had so many shared similar experiences. And that's kind of how we learned what it means to be Afghan. Um, because, like I said, I can't tell if this is just my family, if this is just me, or if this is what every family is like. And so, connecting with other Afghan families who actually weren't related to, they probably are related to us, honestly, but who weren't closely related to us, it's been really heartwarming and fun to hear some of the more idiosyncratic things, like every Afghan, like we will just be out and our parents or our family members will say like, oh, do you see that person over there is Afghan? And I'll be like, oh my gosh, you think everybody's Afghan? And he'll say, no, that person was actually in my third grade class. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then they'll go and introduce themselves and they're like, oh yes, and they'll just talk totally normal. I'm like, oh my gosh, how is it that we are halfway around the world, years later? I've heard, oh, that person was our mail carrier. That person was in charge. That person worked at the ministry of whatever. And I'm like, I just can't imagine that. That seems so, that always blows my mind. And so many of my people that I work with and just friends have also share stories similar to that. And it's just really funny that it's not just like, oh, you are from the same country. Wow. It's like, we grew up together, remember? And I'm like, oh my God, this is very specific. So um, that's just like a funny story. But you asked me what it was like growing up. I think there's many religions in Afghanistan. I was raised Muslim. I remember people not even knowing what Islam was. I feel like maybe I'm aging myself a little bit there because now everybody kind of grows. They're like, oh, it's just a very commonly known thing. But when I was growing up, people didn't know what Muslims were. People didn't even know that people had never heard of Afghanistan, if you can believe it. A lot of that changed very quickly overnight. As I grew up, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and um, I don't know how many minutes it's been, but I mean, you cannot talk. I'm so annoyed that we can't talk about Afghanistan without talking about 9/11 because it has nothing to do with us, but uh, it did impact us a lot, and everything from social consequences and bullying and being called names, things like that, but all the way up to things like surveillance and being questioned and things. I've heard so many people had those experiences, especially people who were in New York at the time. And it's kind of a funny thing that we all kind of share now, but it was not funny at the time. So,
Right.
um,
Wow.
yeah, that's one of the things that makes the experience singular. Like I said, um, people from some countries, they'll be like, oh my gosh, so beautiful. Oh, I've been there, or I've always wanted to go. Wow, so great. People do not say that. When people find out that I'm from Afghanistan, they're either very shocked. They just look at me like I'm from another planet, or they will often say like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," which is a really weird thing to say to someone. Um,
Wow. Is that referring to the US withdrawal, or I wonder what do you sense is the
Ma'am,
issue for the being sorry?
I do not know, and I kind of don't
Okay.
even want to know. But yeah,
Okay.
it's across the board. Um, so yeah.
Right, right, right. Okay, okay. Cool. All right. So wow. I spoke with a lady who's from Senegal. Her interview is on here, Aisha, and she talks about like, not opting for veiling, as
Mhm.
a Muslim woman, and telling the story of how shocked they were when things happened back then, and then all of a sudden it just kind of shifted towards hostility towards just everybody who would be considered Muslim. So, and I can imagine, like,
Yeah.
not being afraid to walk out of your door because you don't know what you'll be met with. So, it was an interesting time for like a lot of people, right? And
Yeah.
lots of tension in the air. Is it Urdu or Farsi? Which one is it that you guys speak in Afghanistan, or
So
your family in particular?
so Afghans usually speak Dari, which is a version of Farsi. Um, Pashtuns is one of the ethnic groups speak Pashto, and that's what I grew up speaking. That was actually my first language, and it's girl. Don't ask me to speak it right now, but um, I do. I was taking lessons for a while. I do speak it at home with my dad somewhat, um, but a really sweet story is I actually have a cousin who is also here in LA, and we have been. We'll just get on FaceTime calls, and we will actually practice our Pashto with each other as much as we can, and that's I just think that's so cute. And you know, 12-year-old Sarah would have never wanted to do that. I would have just really distanced myself. When you go to people and you say, "Oh, this is where I'm from," or "This is my religion," or "This is the language I speak," and they don't register it at all, like it wasn't even negative. It was just they were like, "I've never heard that. What are you talking about?" Um, my reaction to that was I also would distance myself from it, and I also was like, well, if you've never heard of it, I don't want to hear about it either. Um, and I really, so many of us feel guilt and sort of feel bad for doing that. But like I said, it's never too late to reconnect, and you can practice with your cousins, and you could still do it.
Okay. So that was what it was like for you growing up. I wonder, the typical immigrant child experience of, having your career path decided for you. Like, what was that
Mhm.
like? Like going off to college, finishing high school, choosing what you were going to study. What is it like in the Afghan community? Is it pretty typical where your only options are lawyer, doctor, engineer, or what? Were your
we
parents
do
different?
we do have a lot of lawyers, doctors, and engineers, but we also have a lot of entrepreneurs, I would say. In my family, both of my parents were, my dad especially is a lifelong academic, and every Afghan will tell you the most important thing in their family is education. I don't think that's just for immigrants. I think that's in my experience, that's just a very inherently Afghan value. Um, so I knew that I was going to go to college. I wanted to, and I knew that that was really important. My mom actually had a few different careers. She actually went to law school, um, and I don't know, I was little, but I think maybe she didn't pass the bar, or for some reason she didn't become a practicing lawyer. And then she actually became a therapist. Um, and I really love that I just ended up following in her footsteps really on my own. Like I grew up, so I knew I was going to go to college. Often Afghan girls, in my experience, a lot of us, um, that was one of the main like available ways to leave home and grow up. Um, a lot of us didn't just grow up, turn 18, and go out and get an apartment, which I think some of our more, I'm sure it's different in every culture, but for us, that was really not an option generally. My sister did actually grow up and get her own apartment. So she, there's exceptions everywhere. But I knew I was going to go to college. I actually got on an airplane for the first time. I went to school on the East Coast. And I remember at the airport, my mom, my mom came with me to the gate. So I think it's because I was only 17 when I did that. So they were like, okay, that's fine. Anyway, so getting to college for the first time on the East Coast was also very much a culture shock. And I had an extremely liberal arts education. I studied art history and Latin, and I would do it again. And every few times a year, that becomes really useful, but for the most part, nobody really knows about it. And that was really just my education was important. There wasn't too much of a stress on what I was going to do with it. That might be specific to my family. Just, my dad has been a professor his whole life, and my mom had a very specific career. But fast forwarding, when I did decide to go to graduate school, I ended up pursuing the same field as my mom. I actually got the same degree as her. And I worked in the nonprofit world for almost 10 years. And more recently, so I started my business in 2018, and I still think my dad doesn't fully understand what I do. I don't know if he would say that. I think he says, "Of course I know what you do," but and to be fair, I think people who are not entrepreneurs or who don't start their own business really don't understand what it takes and why would someone do that. And people either think it's really, really easy and you just sit there and you count your money and, you have a business that just kind of generates money for you and you don't have to do very much work. Not true, by the way. Or they think it's way too hard and they could never do it. And oh my gosh, I don't even know where I would start. Which it is really hard, but people you can learn how to do it.
Join us again next time for part 2 of this episode. We thank our listeners around the world, and we appreciate your continued support as we build our human library. Please remember to give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and share with your friends, family, and circle of influence.